All right, this is a famous passage. Let's see if we can do something exciting with it. This is from the Gospel according to Luke in the 15th chapter, verses 11 through 32, commonly known as the parable of the prodigal son, but there are 3 stories in here, so let's pay attention and catch all of them. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So the father divided his property between them. And a few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare? But here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father, but while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion, and he ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. And then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father interrupted and said to his slaves, 'Quickly, bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him, and put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again, was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder brother was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. And he replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has got him back safe and sound.' And then the older brother became angry and refused to go in. And his father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I've been working like a slave for you, and I've never disobeyed your command, and yet you have never given me even so much as a young goat, so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' And then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
All right, there are 3 stories in here. There's the story of the prodigal son, but there's also the story of the father. And commonly when we interpret this parable, we interpret the father as though the father were God, as though this were an allegory. But actually, there's some features of this father here that are not God-like, even though there are others that are. So I think we need to pay attention to the story of the father as well. And then there's the story of the elder brother. So there's 3 stories I want to look at, and they all have to do with things that we need to pay attention to, because they may become a part of our lives, and we may need to take advice from the Scripture. So I want us to look at all of this. Parables are interesting things. They are stories that Jesus tells to illustrate a point, but they are also frequently stories that have a hook in them. And sometimes it's a sneaky hook. Sometimes it's a sneaky hook. In fact, this story of the prodigal son was told in such a place to such people as Jesus was aiming more nearly at those who were like the elder brother than he was aiming at people who might be like the prodigal son. The parables sometimes have sneaky hooks in them that are designed to get us to identify one way or another with the people in the parable, and then sometimes surprise us. Now, the youngest son. All right, this is the famous part. I don't have to say much about this. Everyone knows what it is to be a prodigal, to go out and spend all you've got goofing and partying off. You've all been to college. And even if you didn't do that, you certainly saw people who did, right? Even if you didn't, you saw people who did. I mean, what better example could there be of taking your parents' money and spending it on dissolute living than the people you meet in college who are majoring in partying? Right? And then they annually publish in some magazine or other a list of the top 10 party schools in the nation. There are 2 of them in Florida that usually rank fairly high. So there's that. We all see examples of that. And the point of this story is, you can always stop it, turn around and go home again. You can always go home again. There was an American author named Thomas Wolfe who wrote a book entitled You Can't Go Home Again. But he was talking about the fact that when you go home again, you've changed and they've changed, and so it's not the same home. But he didn't mean you couldn't go back. He meant you shouldn't kid yourself about what it will be when you go back. Another American, a poet named Robert Frost, wrote a poem called The Return of the Hired Hand, in which he defined home like this. Home is the place where, when you have to go there, they have to take you in. You can always turn around and go home again. And that's important to realize, because I've seen more than a few times people who get so far out in trouble that they think they can't go back. I had a girlfriend in high school, a girl named Selena. Quite beautiful. I mean, most girls are beautiful, but she was noteworthily beautiful. A singer, red hair. I've always been a sucker for red hair. And it was great. She was my girlfriend twice, in fact. Because, you see, I was her good guy boyfriend. Whenever she was in trouble with her parents, she would go out with me again for 6 or 7 months until her parents were convinced that everything was all right. And then she would drop me and go out with the partying guys. And when she got into bad trouble, she came back and she picked me up again for another 6 or 7 months. I didn't notice this until after high school, because she was beautiful, she sang. I mean, you know, what more could you want in a girl in high school? I finally figured it out. I was at college, and it was my second year at college, and I got a phone call. Now, I'd gone to high school in Maryland, and that's where I knew Selena, but I was at college in Portland, Oregon. I'd gone back home to Oregon to go to college. And I got a phone call from Selena, whom I hadn't talked to in more than a year. And she had a story to tell. She'd hooked up with a musician and run off with him almost as soon as she graduated from high school. And they ran off to Los Angeles, where he was trying to get into the music business, and nothing worked out, and he dropped her and left her, and she was stranded in Los Angeles with not a dollar to her name, and she was pregnant. Real story, actually happened like that. And she called me because she didn't dare call her parents. She didn't dare call her parents. She thought that she couldn't go home again. Well, I didn't have enough money to bring her up from Los Angeles to where I was, and I'd grown a little bit, so I wasn't quite that foolish either. But I did know something, because I was the good boy boyfriend that her parents approved of. So when I'd been her boyfriend, I'd been able to do things with her parents. Her older brother was in the Boy Scouts like I was. Her father had a sailboat and would take me sailing. I never had a chance to go sailing before. I actually knew her parents fairly well. And I told her, I said, call your parents. They'll buy you a plane ticket without even asking you for an explanation of what's going on and why you're stuck. And they may fuss at you some when you get home, but until you get home, they're going to buy the plane ticket, they're going to give you whatever you need to come home again. They're not even going to blink, they're not going to hesitate. And so she did, and that's exactly what happened. She went on home. Things settled down. And somewhere, she even managed to get married in the next year or so to a man who was perfectly comfortable adopting her child. Somewhere there's a kid running around named Paul Harold, who is partly named for me. But the thing I remember most about that, well, she wasn't going to name him after the musician who abandoned her. The thing I remember about that was that she was afraid to try to go home. She thought she'd gone so far away that it wasn't possible to go home again. And she was wrong about that. She was so wrong about that that even I knew it. It's always possible to turn around and go home again. And that's one of the lessons from this parable that I want us to pick up. Especially because sooner or later in our lives, almost all of us will do something stupid enough that we are afraid to go back. Maybe not as badly as Selena, probably not, but a little bit afraid to go back. I want to talk about the Father now. I mean, the Father does this thing that's so godlike at the end. He welcomes the Son back. He throws a big party for him. He doesn't even blink. He just takes him in his arms. However, he started by indulging the kid. He was not fair between the kid and his brothers. It says, divide the property between us. Well, he divided the property and gave it to the younger son and took off with it. But the half that was belonging to the older son, he actually kept. The older son was still there working for him. He was a farmer. He didn't throw the farm away. It wasn't as though his wealth was all in cash. He wasn't fair between the two boys. He was careless and foolish about what he gave the younger son. And he didn't pay close attention to the good boy, to the son who stayed home and did right. My wife Linda grew up in the church, never conscious of not being a Christian, grew up in the church, and in a medium big church, about 800 to 1,100 people at various times, large high school fellowship, later a large college fellowship, and she discovered something. Kids who got in trouble and came back to fellowship. Kids who got in trouble and came back to church. Kids who ran off to college and smoked a lot of dope, but then came back to the fellowship later, were celebrated. Everyone was excited about them. These were classic examples of what Christian faith meant. To fall into foolishness and sin, and then to turn around and come back. And the good kids, like her, didn't get any attention at all. Or not much. Or maybe thank yous because they always dug in and did some of the work that was necessary to make the fellowship happen. But nobody regarded them as famous examples of faith because they didn't do anything spectacular like fall away and then come back. Oh, that's Linda. She's a goody-goody. Not a bad goody-goody, but a goody-goody. She never does anything wrong in the first place. So, I mean, if you never do anything wrong, how mature can your faith be? What? What? That doesn't make any sense if you think it out. But in terms of attitudes, people frequently make the mistake of celebrating the return of the prodigal more than they do the faithfulness of those who never leave. And the Father didn't pay good attention to that. So that's the other thing I want us to take care of. That we don't fall into the foolishness of celebrating a falling away from faith for the sake of the coming back again, more than we trust and celebrate the faith of those who are always steady. And then too, there's the elder son's resentment. This is the trap in the parable that Jesus is telling, because he's telling it to catch the Pharisees, who say to themselves, I've always been good, I've always done what's right, how come you're preaching a message of gospel that tells these poor people, these foolish people, these sinners, these prostitutes and tax collectors, that they're welcome in the kingdom of heaven? And you're mad at us for being self-righteous, when we've done what's good all along, and they've been terrible. And Jesus is trying to trap them into realizing that their resentment is as bad or worse a sin than anything the others did. And also to teach them a lesson. Somehow people want to think, I deserve more from God because I've been good and never strayed and stayed here all along. I deserve something more. Yes, of course, God should save those prodigals. Yes, of course, God should save sinners. But some of us should get something more, shouldn't we? Haven't we done better? And the problem is that there's no more to give, because God gives His entire self when He gives Himself at all. And if He gives Himself to sinners at all, such as we all are in some way or another, He gives His whole self. So what more is there extra to give to the good people who never ran away and spent their money carelessly and casually? We have to remind ourselves never to resent the good things that other people get. And that can be tricky because we are built to resent it. I have children. I now have grandchildren. When my kids were little, there was a thing I noticed when they were playing together. No toy was so much worth having, was so much fun to play with as the one that somebody else had. And they wanted what somebody else had at any given time. It was very common. Not all the time, but so frequently. And I've noticed it in other kids too, at daycares, at preschool classes. We're built so that we resent what other people have if it's anything that we want at all. It's perfectly natural to us in our sinful state. It's easy for us to fall into resentment when other people get the good things, or to resent God when we don't get something extra. So those are the three stories I wanted us to get out of this parable. One, we can always turn around and come home. Two, we got to be careful to be fair and to remember that everybody is someone who has turned to God, which is the most difficult thing in the world, not just those who ran off into an obvious bad place. And three, we don't dare resent what other people get from God. It's what we want from God too. And it's no less than God can give or will give to anyone. Come home, be fair, and don't resent others. Three stories from this parable, that's what I got. Sermon discussion class after snack upstairs, and we'll talk about it, especially looking for any examples from your own life that tie in with any of this.